Oops, I did it again. I committed the same mistake that millions of other bakers around the world have committed before. I really wish I had known about this before starting to make bread. This dough is seriously broken, but this dough is much better. And the only difference between this dough and that dough is that this dough has way too much water. It's overhydrated. And this happens to so many bakers around the world. You follow a recipe that you find on the internet and then you try to follow exactly the steps, but for some reason your dough just turns into a soup, and overall your first sourdough bread is going to be a disaster. It's very sticky, it's very hard to handle, and chances are this is because you use too much water for your dough. I will show you the headache, the frustration this dough is going to create in comparison to this dough. And then I'll talk about 6 consequences, and very likely you already faced some of them without knowing that this is the root of evil. So by watching this video, you will learn a key crucial thing about bread making, which is how to properly hydrate your dough. And this is gonna free you from so many headaches that many beginners are facing. So the recipe for both doughs. This dough here, our soup dough, has around 500 grams of flour, 400 grams of water, 50 grams of sourdough starter, and 10 grams of salt. So this dough here is almost exactly the same. 500 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 50 grams of sourdough starter, and 10 grams of salt. So this hydration is way lower than the other dough. And you can already see here, this soup dough, we are going to save it in a bit, and I will show you how this dough is not lost. But this dough here already, I just mixed the ingredients. I didn't even properly mix them. I just put them together, waited a little bit, and just see the difference already. This dough is so much easier to handle already. One of the key things you need to understand is the closer your flour is to a whole flour, so a whole wheat or whole rye flour, the more water your dough is going to be able to soak up. The closer it is to a basic cake flour, the less water your dough is going to need. For wheat flours, it's also important to consider how much protein your flour has. For wheat, that's around 80% gluten. So the higher the protein amount, the more water your dough is going to be able to soak up. And that's a very, very important consideration when making a dough. So whenever you see a recipe that suggests you use X amount of water for your flour, without the recipe specifying exactly the flour that you should be using, then it's not going to work, because every flour is unique. When bakers talk about hydration, so how much water you have in your dough, they like to use percentages. This is called baker's math. This way they can easily scale up or down the recipe. So if we had a hydration of 50%, we would look at the total amount of flour, which would be in our case 500 grams. Then we calculate 50% based on that, so that would be 250 grams. All the other ingredients are also specified as a percentage, which really makes everything so much easier if you're working in a bakery and you have to handle large amounts of dough. So use the hydration 50%. So for 500 grams of flour, try to start with 250 grams of water. In many cases, I've seen the sweet spot to be around 60% hydration. So 300 grams of water for 500 grams of flour. Try this. And this is going to save you from so many issues down the line of fermenting this dough. It will free you from so much headache. And that's something that I would like to talk about now. There are 6 consequences you will be facing by using too much water for your dough. Number 1, you have to knead more and invest more time. As you can see, this dough is already looking pretty decent. It's a wheat-based dough, and you can already see that I sort of have a gluten network developed simply by mixing this for a few minutes and letting the dough sit. So I effectively have to spend way less time on getting this dough together. When working with wheat-based doughs, the secret when kneading is really to mix everything together, wait a little bit. The gluten network is going to form automatically. You don't have to spend so much time working the dough. Just mixing it, waiting for instance 15 minutes and then coming back to the dough is going to create you a superb dough without having to knead too much and spend too much time. So don't overwork the dough, take it easy, mix it a bit, wait, and then continue. Whereas with this dough here, imagine how am I going to knead this dough? It's just completely overhydrated. This is like a soup. And the only thing I can do to save it now is to add a bit more flour. I'm never going to be able to develop a gluten network like this. And by doing so, I of course have an additional issue. All my previous calculations like salt, sourdough starter and so on, they don't work. But I don't want to waste this dough, so the only option is to add a bit more flour until I am at a point where I'm happy with the dough. So what you could do here with this dough is you could put that into a stand mixer and then use a spatula to mix this dough on a high speed. At some point this dough is going to come together. The other option, what many bakers like to do if they want to make a dough which has a very high hydration, they use the bassinage method. And that is you start with a more stiff dough, you knead it, and then you add more water, and then this water is going to merge with the gluten network. And this way you can really push the hydration of the dough to crazy levels. However, this is really expert mode, and in most cases you really don't want to do that. Why would you want to create a dough which has so much water? In 95% of the cases you don't want to do that. There are of course a few exceptions. The exceptions being, the dough is more extensible, and that means it can be stretched more easily by the microorganisms in your starter. And this means that overall the crumb might be a bit more fluffy. Now many experts believe that you can only get an open crumb if you have a dough which has a high hydration, but this is not true. You can also get a nice fluffy crumb if you make a dough with a lower hydration. However, time your fermentation perfectly. If you look at the Neapolitan pizza, for instance, it's only 60% hydration, but still the edge of the pizza is very fluffy. So you can achieve the same thing by timing your fermentation perfectly. A longer fermentation is automatically going to create you a more extensible dough, which can more easily be inflated by your microorganisms. So to achieve open crumb, sure, you could push the hydration a bit, but the much safer bet is to just time your fermentation perfectly with a stiffer dough like we're making in this video. And the dough that I'll show you at the end of the video features this low hydration, and it's super fluffy. And I on purposely used a very weak flour, so a flour with very little gluten, because not everybody has expert flour at hand. Actually, this might have been a bit too much flour now. But yeah, now all my proportions of sourdough starter, salt, and everything, they are out of hand. But the dough before simply wasn't manageable. But we're saving this by adding a bit more flour, actually a bit more, lots of flour, until it's in a state where we can use it. And you see this catastrophe. This dough is so sticky still. This is not fun to knead. What a frustrating experience. So please don't do this to yourself. Having a dough which is high in hydration is really expert mode. Going lower in hydration, you can make exactly the same bread, and it's way less work. It's all sticky, it's a mess. And just note how much time I'm spending on trying to get this dough together. So I guess you understood the point. Overly hydrated will cause you an issue, because you have to knead more, you have to spend more time. Around 15 minutes pass, and let's test the gluten development of these two doughs to see how much more work we have to perform. I'm going to start with this dough, and I can see that this has already come together. This dough doesn't need any more kneading. It's also sort of there already, but it's still not, it tears relatively quickly. So I need to knead this dough even further. And this is when people do things like bench kneading and lamination. And let's do that for this dough because, yeah, it needs more time and effort. So I have to spend even more time on this dough compared to this dough. Here I could just round this up and I would be ready. I will be doing 5 minutes of bench kneading, which is a really good way to create dough strength. So if you wanted to go with this dough, see, it's sticky, it sticks to the surface. And my hands are again a complete mess. Also, my countertop is turning into a complete mess. I will let this rest now for another 15 minutes and then proceed with lamination. I can just round this up to a nice smooth dough ball, and look at how easily I can handle this dough. So much easier. Wow, this low hydration dough has really been a pleasure to work with. It's not sticky, it's nice to handle, the surface is very smooth, it doesn't stick to my hands, it's perfect. But now let's go back to our monster super hydrated dough, and I'll show you how we can put that dough together regardless. Okay, Our dough has flattened out quite a lot, but the gluten already looks nicely developed. I want to give this an additional set of lamination, and let me show you how that works. I'm spreading the dough thinly on the kitchen counter. Oh boy, you see that? This is probably because I've been adding a bit additional flour, some chunks of flour. Not very nice. By creating this large surface, I can really nicely glue the dough together, creating superb dough strength. Folding the dough into the middle, stretching it before I do. Same thing from the other side. Using my dough scraper as a helper. And now, just like if I were to shape the dough, I'm taking the dough, stretching it a bit, and rolling it over. And just like that, our dough now nicely holds together. But whew, this was a lot of work. The surface will tear a bit because we just worked the dough. I'll let it sit for another 5 minutes and then do the smoothing of the surface one more time, because right now it's still a bit sticky. We want the surface to be as smooth as possible for the dough not to stick to our hands. So let's make our dough surface nice and smooth by dragging it over the kitchen counter. Nice, we did it. We saved our dough, but this was a lot of hassle. And now this was just the tip of the iceberg. There are going to be 5 more issues we'll be facing with this dough, and I'll walk you through them. And chances are that you have experienced at least some of them. And now the next set of issues is going to start. This dough, which is our overly hydrated dough, which we managed to sort of put back together, requires a lot more work during the course of fermentation. That is because this dough doesn't have as much dough strength as this dough. This dough is less hydrated, and thus it's more elastic, it holds together better. So for this type of dough, I might be doing no stretch and folds at all if I make this as an overnight dough, which I frequently do. For this dough, however, since it's becoming more extensible throughout the fermentation, I need to fix that by giving it more stretch and folds. These stretch and folds are creating additional dough strength. So I have to spend way more work on this dough than on this dough. Plus, this dough here is way stickier, so stretching and folding is a much bigger pain compared to the other dough. With wetted hands, I'm carefully raising the dough, folding it over, and then I repeat the same thing from the other side. This is an important thing to learn. You only really have to stretch and fold the dough when you see that it's flattening out. And the more water you're using, the more often you have to do this. I'm doing the same thing for the other dough, and overall it already feels way less sticky. So stretching and folding is way easier on this dough compared to the other dough. Small advertisement in between. I wrote this book, The Sourdough Framework, which is really a deep dive on advanced baking techniques, which covers the science and everything you need to know to master making bread at home. It doesn't teach you a recipe, it teaches you everything you need to know to understand your dough, how it's fermenting, and to become an expert baker. After reading this book, you can read every other book out there and you'll know exactly what are the key factors to look at. Now, this whole book is also available completely for free on the-sourdough-framework.com. But if you like what I'm doing, if you want to support my work, you can consider getting one of these beautifully designed hardcover copies. So by using more water, we have created a lot more work for us as a baker. I will continue to let this ferment a little bit longer until it roughly increased in size by 50%, and then we will be facing the next issue, which is shaping. Shaping this dough is going to be way harder than shaping this dough. So our doughs have nicely inflated and now it's time to shape them. Our super hydrated dough that's now looking a lot nicer because we gave it extra dough strength. We did some stretch and folds, and our regular dough with less hydration, which is so much easier to handle. Let's shape them. Shaping this one is going to be way easier than this. This is expert mode. This is the dough you want to test shaping with. This is always my default technique. I just sprinkle a bit of flour to make this side non-stick. And then just flip over the pot. It should let go of the container. That's a good sign. Sticky side is here. Just gonna take this, place in the middle. Oh, it's so nice and puffy already. Looking great. Wow, an amazing dough. It's really very, very puffy. So people telling me you can't achieve this with low hydration, just check out how fluffy this dough is. I'm gonna give it a good extra rub with some flour and then I'll place it in my Banneton. Now, this dough is not gonna stick to the Banneton as much as the other dough. So this is another challenge you're going to face. The overly hydrated dough will stick a lot more to the Banneton than this dough. Gently place it inside and there we go. What I can do for this dough, I can also place it inside of a Banneton, but then I would probably want to use a liner for the Banneton. Could also be a kitchen towel, which really helps that the dough doesn't stick to it. Let's repeat the same thing with the other dough. I do have slightly different plans because now this dough is much bigger. It wouldn't fit into one Banneton. I would need to divide it and put it into two Bannetons. But I'm going to be making a sandwich loaf out of this one. Wow. This dough is just so big. We have created a monster. It might look very easy to you how I'm doing this, but handling this dough I have to be much more careful because it's way stickier. I can already feel it when touching the dough here. So this will make shaping even harder. And we have created a massive dough roll. We would need a super Banneton. I'm going to be using my loaf pan now. Ta-da! This is going to create us an amazing sandwich loaf. So shaping much harder on this dough than on this dough. Just by lowering the hydration, shaping, which is normally so hard to master, will be way, way easier for you. Number 5 is that your dough is likely going to flatten out a lot more during baking if your dough is overly hydrated. Of course, you could knead more at the start and apply more stretch and folds to get that dough strength. But this is expert mode and requires a lot of time. So your bread is likely going to flatten out during baking. In terms of fluffiness, this is not that big of a deal because the dough might still be very fluffy on the inside, but this is also sort of about expectation management. People want to have a beautifully, nicely risen bread that's coming out of the oven and has this sort of typical bunny shape. And this is something you cannot achieve with a dough that has too little dough strength. Fail. Just look at how puffy this bread is. And the same thing probably happened to this one. I can barely open the loaf pan. It seems stuck. That was a fail. But this dough here is not lost. We will save it. Okay, because I added too much flour, this increased way too much from my loaf pan. And I can't bake it like this. I wanted to make a nice sandwich bread. The option that I'll opt for now is I'll turn this into nice bread rolls. But first, because I don't have the space in the oven, I'm going to start with just baking this one. Unfortunately, I lost a little bit of dough while trying to open this up. No bueno. This will go back to the fridge and then I will show you the final results. The lower hydration one, it should let go of the Banneton fairly easily. Wow, look at that. Not even using a liner. It's not sticky, it didn't stick to the Banneton. This is perfect. And of course I screwed up scoring a bit. The lower hydration one, it should let go of the Banneton fairly easily. Wow, look at that. Not even using a liner. It's not sticky, it didn't stick to the Banneton. This is perfect. And of course I screwed up scoring a bit. Now let's take this dough and fix it by creating some beautiful chop buns. Let's see if the dough actually lets go here. Look at how super inflated it is. I'm just gonna chop this now into 2 halves. The other half will go back into the loaf pan. Okay, and now all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna chop a piece of dough, place it in water, and then in some seeds. And then onto my parchment paper. I love doing this. It's such an easy way to create great bread rolls. Also some oats here. And these are our chop buns. And let's bake them and check the results. Ta-da! This is what we've made. We have made it a beautiful assorted set of bread rolls and a really nice looking batard. I suspect this might have over fermented a little bit because I placed it at the top of my fridge and there it's a bit warmer, and just a slight change can already mean, yeah, that it ferments a bit too much. So maybe this in combination with me screwing up the scoring a little bit could have caused the bread to not open up as nicely, but just look at the sheer size of this loaf. I think it's looking amazing. Let's see the crumb structure. And wow, look at this super airy, nice looking crumb. This is looking perfect. It's super fluffy. And let's also have a look at one of our bread rolls. Also looks nice and fluffy. Not as airy as this one, but that might have been me chopping the dough into pieces and placing it on the surface while it already was nicely proofed. This was really an excellent save. And now the last issue, which I think is really the most important issue you are facing with overly hydrated doughs. So the more water your dough has, the more bacterial fermentation you have, the less yeast fermentation. The bacteria mostly creates a tangy flavor in the end, and the yeast is creating the fluffy texture, and you want to have a balance of these two. If your dough is overly hydrated, you'll have more of this bacterial fermentation and less of this yeast fermentation. So a dough that's lower in hydration will give you more yeast fermentation. And that's great because the gluten doesn't degrade as fast, and you in the end have a better combination of textures. The dough is going to be a bit more fluffy, especially when baking with flours which don't have such a high protein content. Having a more yeast fermentation is going to help you a lot. You will not run into issues of over fermentation as quickly. So a lower hydrated dough has less chances of being over fermented, which is the #1 issue that many bakers are facing when baking with sourdough.